7 continents, 1 world. Bringing you the latest in international news from the WRHU studio in Hempstead, New York on 88.7 FM and WRHU.org. This is Around the World in 30 minutes with Eli Finkelson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, to keep you updated on the world around you. Starting off the evening, protests in Cancun, Mexico turned violent after police opened fire into the crowd. The protests were an outrage of 2 murders that took place earlier this week, but they turned bloody when multiple protesters attempted to breach City Hall. 2 people were killed as well as 2 people injured. Governor of the state, Carlos Joaquin Gonzalez, condemned the acts of violence by the police and said that he gave them strict orders to keep everything peaceful. He also said that the police chief knowingly disobeyed his orders and instead of using rubber bullets, used live ammunition. The mayor of Cancun also condemned the violence. In South America, protests in the Peruvian capital of Lima have also turned violent, leading to clashes between demonstrators and riot police. The protests in Lima have been ongoing since now ex-Peruvian President Martin Vizcarra was impeached on November 9th. Vizcarra, who enjoys a high level of popularity in Peru, was ousted over allegations that he exchanged government contracts in return for bribes. Peruvian Speaker of Congress Manuel Merino was sworn in as country's interim president on the same day. Some supporters of former President Vizcarra have labeled the transition a coup. Serious concerns remain over the stability of Peru, which is also facing a severe economic downturn caused by the coronavirus pandemic. Moving over to Europe with some lighter news, a team of French Muslims has been guarding their town's church in response to the recent attacks in Nice. El Zayed Ben Farrat, a Muslim living in the French town of Lodève, enlisted a group of friends to help symbolically guard their town's church on All Saints' Day. The gesture was made in conjunction with French police and was well received by locals. Priest Luis Iniguez said the actions of the group gave him hope in a difficult time. Ben Farrat said he would like to make a similar gesture on Christmas, and he hopes his actions will spread throughout the country. Unfortunately, news can't all be positive. 4 shipwrecks in just 3 days have killed over 110 people in the Mediterranean. The victims were refugees attempting to travel to Europe. One shipwreck, which occurred off the coast of Libya, killed at least 74 people. Good weather in the Mediterranean has led to human smugglers increasing the frequency of trips across the sea. Unfortunately, many of these attempts lead to tragedy due to poor safety standards aboard the vessels. So far in 2020, over 10,000 migrants have been intercepted in the Mediterranean and sent back to Libya. 575 migrants are confirmed to have drowned in the Mediterranean this year alone, but the real number is believed to be higher. In Africa, a peacekeeping force helicopter crashed in the Sinai Peninsula on Thursday, November 12th. The multinational force and observers reported 8 members on the flight, with 7 of them dying on impact. The crew was made up of 6 Americans, along with French and Czech nationals. The only survivor was 1 American who was in critical condition at a local Israeli hospital. Despite some terrorist activity in the Sinai region, it is believed this crash was an accident, although the MFO is investigating the incident. Ethiopia is on the verge of civil war this week after tensions escalated in the Tigray region. The Ethiopian government has set out military attacks against the Tigray People's Liberation Forces early last week. The government is now blaming the TPLF for a massacre that took place on Monday, November 9th. Amnesty International estimates a few hundred people were stabbed to death in this event. There was the first major bloodshed to take place due to this conflict. Amnesty International has also reported thousands of refugees fleeing from the Tigray region into bordering Sudan. Pioneer President of Ghana, Jerry John Rawlings, has passed away at the age of 73. He seized power in 1979 after leading 2 coups and executing multiple top government heads. After this, he turned Ghana into one of the most stable democracies in all of Africa. Ghana is taking a week to mourn the death and are suspending many activities and other government events. There has also been an outpouring of support from other African leaders. Ghana will now be holding elections for the presidency in the next few weeks. A ceasefire between Armenia and Azerbaijan took effect on November 10th, effectively ending their war over the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region. The ceasefire comes after over a month of heavy fighting in the region between Armenian and Azerbaijani forces. The brief conflict has resulted in thousands of casualties and led to the displacement of thousands. Under the terms of the ceasefire, Azerbaijan gained control of the majority of the disputed territory. The announcement of the ceasefire led to large-scale celebrations in the Azerbaijani capital of Baku. News of the ceasefire led to widespread demonstrations in Armenia, during which the Armenian parliament building was seized by protesters. An Armenian politician was badly beaten by a mob outside of the building, but is presently said to be in good condition. Over in Asia, the Chinese government has been slowly taking rights away from the peoples of Hong Kong. This week, however, many may have been the final straw in keeping them autonomous. In an act of protest, almost all of the pro-democracy government officials in Beijing have resigned. This leaves little to no representation for the people of Hong Kong within the Chinese government. The UK has condemned the continuous Chinese aggression and have said they are violating the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Finally, the Australian government has announced the creation of a new investigative agency tasked with building criminal cases against the Australian soldiers accused of war crimes. The agency, which will be named the Office of the Special Investigator, was created after a 4-year-long investigation into soldiers of the Australian Commando Regiments and Special Air Service. Soldiers belonging to these units are believed to have committed numerous war crimes between 2005 and 2016 in Afghanistan. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison said the new agency was necessary to prevent police forces from being overwhelmed. A report on the investigation is set to be made public next week. Prime Minister Morrison stated the contents of the report will be, quote, difficult news. And now for our continuing coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic. For the latest coronavirus stories and numbers from around the world, let's go to WRHU reporter Connor Donnelly. Connor?
Thank you, Eli. Good evening, everyone. I'm Connor Donnelly with your COVID-19 World Outlook. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is in self-isolation after being in contact with a member of Parliament that tested positive for the virus. Johnson says he is feeling well, but urged people to treat the virus seriously and not to lapse in practicing social distancing. The United Kingdom is also negotiating with Moderna for the distribution of their new vaccine, which is reported to have a preliminary protection rate of 95%. In Germany, Chancellor Angela Merkel is considering additional restrictions and guidelines targeting young people. This would include further limiting social gatherings and stricter requirements for self-isolation. Down in Latin America, Mexico has surpassed 1 million coronavirus cases and is close to passing 100,000 deaths. This is the second highest death toll in Latin America and fourth in the world. Mexico has administered comparatively few COVID tests, which makes contact tracing difficult for medical professionals. Down in Brazil, trials have resumed for the Chinese CoronaVac vaccine after it was suspended 3 days ago. Brazil's National Health Agency Anvisa says they suspended the trial to investigate a death, but it determined it was not related to the vaccine. Earlier this week, Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro spoke out against the scientific community over the virus and used a homophobic slur to describe those concerned. Over in the East, South Korean President Moon Jae-in is asking for public cooperation in combating the virus. A new law that issues fines for failing to wear a mask is coming into effect, as cases spike in the country. Individuals can be fined up to $100 per incident, while businesses that fail to follow the protocols face even larger fines. In China, a citizen journalist faces up to 5 years in jail for her coverage of the outbreak in Wuhan. Zhang Zhan is accused of, quote, picking quarrels and stirring up trouble for accepting interviews with overseas media. In the Middle East, Algeria is set to reimpose lockdown restrictions that will see most businesses operating at decreased hours. The country is experiencing a sharp uptick in cases and is hoping to prevent the overtaxing of their hospitals. Iran remains the hardest hit country in the region, with daily new cases of over 10,000. The country is considering a total lockdown of 2 weeks in the capital Tehran, on top of additional restrictions imposed earlier this week. And across Africa, the number of confirmed cases is nearing 2 million. According to the Africa Centers for Disease Control, the most heavily affected countries are still South Africa, Egypt, and Ethiopia. The World Health Organization is attributing the relatively low death rate partially to Africa's young population. For Around the World in 30 Minutes, I'm Connor Donnelly. Back to you, Eli.
Thank you, Connor, for that report. For those of you just joining us, you're tuned in to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson. Now let's move to our featured topic of the week, the United States' international reputation in the wake of both the COVID-19 pandemic and the chaotic 2020 presidential election. This week I spoke with two experts in the field. First was Edward Alden, senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, specializing in U.S. economic competitiveness, trade, and immigration policy. He's written several books and is a columnist on foreign relations for many well-known sites and papers.
Mr. Alden, how are you today?
I'm very well. It's great to be with you, Eli. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's just dive right in. Prior to the pandemic, can you give us an outlook on how the United States looked on the world stage?
Well, I mean, things have changed pretty dramatically under President Trump. There's a lot more tension with allies than has historically been the case. Trump was very upset about what he saw as lack of military contributions by NATO allies. So relations with Europe on that front have been pretty tense. In North America, there was a lot of disruption associated both with immigration and the renegotiation of NAFTA. Things are a little calmer on that front. The biggest concern is China. U.S. relations with China have grown steadily more contentious, really even preceding President Trump, and certainly over the last 4 years. I think that's going to be the biggest challenge that President-elect Biden and his team will face on the foreign policy front.
And how about after the pandemic began? Once COVID-19 hit, did our image on the world stage change?
Well, I think unfortunately, if anything, it's become worse, partly because our domestic handling of the pandemic, while it varies a lot from state to state, has not been a good one. I mean, about a quarter of the cases in the world and a quarter of the deaths are here in the United States. China and others have done comparatively quite a bit better. So I think that was a big blow to the U.S. The other problem has been that we've continued to walk away from international organizations dealing with these issues. The president wants to pull the United States out of the World Health Organization, and certainly the WHO deserves criticism for some of the ways in which it's responded during the pandemic. But the U.S. pulling out as a unilateral move leaves us isolated in terms of a global response. So I think the position of the U.S. is unfortunately more isolated and weaker since the start of the pandemic than it was at the outset.
Now, you mentioned relations with China, so I want to take a little bit of a deeper look at President Trump's relationship with various foreign leaders. How has Trump's relationships with leaders like Vladimir Putin from Russia, Kim Jong-un from North Korea, and even Xi Jinping from China, how has his relationships with those leaders affected the United States' image, especially in the eyes of ally countries?
Well, I mean, it's pretty clear that President Trump has been cozier with authoritarian leaders than previous U.S. presidents. I mean, his relationship with Russian President Putin, of course, is in various ways connected to his impeachment in the House, even though the specific trigger there was an action in Ukraine. But there's long been a lot of skepticism, certainly here in the United States, about the seeming closeness of the relationship between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. There was the strange dance with Kim Jong-un of North Korea early on in the administration, which, I suppose on the positive side, at least reopened some kind of dialogue between the U.S. and North Korea where none had existed before. On the downside, it appears to have done nothing to slow North Korea's nuclear program, which was the whole reason to engage with North Korea in the first place. Xi Jinping, it's been complicated. Again, at the outset, President Trump emphasized that there was a strong personal relationship between the two of them. He invited President Xi to Mar-a-Lago. Trade with China was very high on his agenda. The trade relationship is not in bad shape these days, despite some of the tensions. But generally speaking, we've seen the U.S. and China grow more and more conflictual. China's actions in Xinjiang in terms of human rights violations there, the increasing encroachment on independence in Hong Kong has been a huge issue, and the United States has been blocking sales of critical technologies like semiconductors to Chinese companies such as Huawei. So generally speaking, that relationship has gotten more and more difficult over the last couple of years.
For those of you just tuning in, you're listening to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm Eli Finkelson, joined right now by Edward Alden, who's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, Mr. Alden, one of your specialties is trade and trade relations. So I want to bring your last answer to a more global scale with how has President Trump shaped U.S. policy when it comes to trade and relations with other countries, not just China, but around the world?
I mean, he really issued in something of a revolution in the U.S. approach. I mean, the United States, since the end of World War II, has been the champion of international trade institutions, most importantly, the World Trade Organization. Critics of U.S. trade policy had argued for a long time that perhaps the U.S. was subordinating its national economic interests to trying to maintain the strength of these international organizations. I mean, President Trump, of course, campaigned and has governed on an America First platform that he said is aimed at rewriting bad trade agreements to bring greater benefits to U.S. workers and U.S. manufacturers. The track record on that is not a good one. I mean, manufacturing is in many ways in a weaker place right now than it was when President Trump started. But he really has changed the tenor of relations with the world. He's used tariffs aggressively, not just against China, but against the Europeans, at times against the Canadians and Mexicans, the Japanese, the Koreans, and others. The World Trade Organization now is on life support. The U.S. has effectively crippled its dispute settlement system. And there are a series of escalating conflicts right now with Europe over aircraft and digital taxes and other issues. So President-elect Biden is going to be handed a very full plate on the trade front, a lot of disputes that are going to need some kind of resolution or forward progress, and a very tough decision of, does the United States try to go back to its old role of being the leader of this multilateral system, or do we move into a new era in which we're just one country among many fighting over the benefits of global trade and investment?
And the America First thought process that President Trump has really brought in also speaks to another one of your specialties, which is immigration. So I want to ask you the same question, but about immigration. How has President Trump's policy shaped the U.S. immigration policy and therefore relations with other countries?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is an area we've seen very profound changes. The Trump administration has basically cut off access for all asylum seekers from Central America primarily. The U.S. has historically admitted large numbers of refugees. These days, Syria and Afghanistan and some African countries are the biggest senders. Trump administration has reduced that number to just 15,000, the lowest in modern U.S. history. And the administration has done various things to make it much harder for what we often refer to as high-skilled or highly educated immigrants to come to the United States through restrictions on student visas, through changes in the regulations in the H-1B program, which is used by a lot of high-skilled foreign workers. So the U.S. immigration policy does not look anything like what it did even 4 years ago. The changes there are even more profound than they are on trade. I mean, in terms of international image, immigration policy has always been an area that's more purely domestic. There's never sort of the architecture of international cooperation the way you've seen with trade, but it's certainly tarnished the U.S. image as a country that was historically welcoming to immigrants, particularly refugees and asylum seekers. This is one area I think we will see a big change under a Democratic administration. President-elect's team has said, for instance, that they're going to lift what is known as the Muslim ban, which was one of President Trump's early actions to block people coming from Muslim majority countries. Biden plans to reinstate the DACA program that many of your listeners may be familiar with, that deals with young people who were brought here illegally by their parents and have had this kind of temporary protected status here in the United States. The Trump administration has been trying to take that away. I think Biden will clearly reinstate it. So this is an area where we will see some big changes in a new administration.
And for those of you just tuning in, you're listening to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm Eli Finkelson, and we're joined right now by Edward Alden, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. So that sort of brings me into my next question, which is, what different ripple effects will Trump's policies have on the global economy for potentially years to come?
Well, I hate to use the "it's too soon to know" answer.
Mhm.
I mean, I think the long-term economic impact is coming from the pandemic, and you can certainly blame the Trump administration over its handling of the pandemic, but it didn't cause the pandemic. And responses to the pandemic have been difficult all over the world. The Europeans are struggling with it almost as much as we are. We've seen economic impacts everywhere in the world. I think this is going to be a long climb out. I mean, in a lot of ways, it looks a little bit like the aftermath of the financial crisis and the Great Recession that followed, after which it took many years for economies, particularly the Western developed economies, the Chinese and some of the Asian economies recovered more quickly, but Western developed economies took 5, 6, 7 years to climb out of the hole that had been created by the 08, 09 recession. We've seen some quick bounce back here, but U.S. economy is far below capacity. So are the European economies. Unemployment in the United States, still at worryingly high levels. Labor force participation is way down. In Europe, a lot of companies are being maintained solely through government payments to try to keep their workforce on the payroll. The Canadians are in a similar situation. So I think that's going to take a long, long time. And then in terms of the developing world, these countries don't have the ability that the U.S. or the Europeans or others have to, essentially print money to try to pump up their economies. They are far more restricted. So I think we're going to see even more severe impacts in a lot of the developing countries. So, I think what President Trump has left behind is not a good situation. Though again, you can't blame him for the pandemic. Though he bears a good share of the responsibility for its poor handling here.
Now, we already sort of touched on what a Biden Harris administration might look like for foreign relations, but how have other countries viewed the United States during what is easily one of the most tumultuous elections in US history?
Well, it's kind of fascinating to watch. I mean, I'm not sure I can give you a complete global tour. I mean, I think if you look from the Chinese perspective, it's reinforced what they've thought for a long time, which is that American democracy is hopelessly dysfunctional. And why would they ever want to even start down the road to more democratic governance? And so I think they're looking at our situation and saying, this just shows that the U.S. is a country in decline and it's becoming weaker and it's not unified. Interestingly, the Chinese have not congratulated the Biden-Harris team. There's speculation as to the reasons for that. Certainly, in a lot of what we consider the more liberal countries, the Europeans, the Canadians, New Zealand, and other places, there's been a fairly effusive outpouring of thank goodness we're going to see the backside of Donald Trump, and so they've stepped up quickly to congratulate the president-elect. Mexico is a very interesting case. I mean, Mexican President Lopez Obrador has made, his policy towards the United States has basically been try not to antagonize the Trump administration at all costs, including doing things I never thought I would see the Mexicans do, like agree to hold asylum seekers who are coming, people coming from Central America who want asylum in the United States, agreeing to hold them on the Mexican side of the border in what are effectively refugee camps in Mexico, and really, in many ways, do the bidding of the Trump administration on migration issues. That's going to be awkward with the new Biden-Harris administration. Again, Mexico, one of the few countries where we haven't seen congratulations from their president to President-elect Biden. So the picture is different in different places. I think, generally speaking, just to kind of wrap up the thought, I think generally speaking, the world will be relieved to have a somewhat more professional team. Trump's actions on the foreign policy front have been very unpredictable, quite personal, sometimes foreign policy announced through tweets. I think we will see with the Biden team, the United States go back to a more predictable sort of foreign policy, which I think will at least be a little easier for the rest of the world to understand, even if they may not always agree with some of the actions the new administration takes.
And one last time, if you're just tuning in, I'm Eli Finkelson here on Around the World in 30 Minutes with WRHU FM. We're joined right now by Edward Alden, Senior Fellow for the Council on Foreign Relations. So finally, my last question for you is just, what are some of the most important factors that a leader of a country like the United States could have, and how do those factors translate into foreign policy?
It's a good question. I mean, I think the quality of that person's team is tremendously important. I mean, foreign policy is conducted at multiple levels up and down the ranks of government here in the United States and other countries, and also involves a lot of outreach to the private sector, to NGOs, to universities, to others. So I think having a strong team is incredibly important, and I worry about what the Trump administration has done to the State Department in particular. There's been a real hollowing out of career State Department officials and the sort of professional expertise the United States needs to conduct foreign policy. In terms of the personal qualities of the leader, I think, as I say, I think a certain amount of predictability helps. Though there are times when leaders want to be less than predictable, but I think the scale of unpredictability during the Trump administration has been really complicated for the rest of the world. I also think personal ties matter, and that's one place that a President Biden would bring a lot of experience. I mean, he's the former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was, of course, vice president during the Obama administration. He has deep relationships with many leaders from all over the world. And I think certainly being able, in a crisis in particular, to pick up the phone and talk to almost anyone in similar positions around the world, I think that is a real advantage as well. And I suspect President-elect will use that.
Are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share on any of the topics that we've covered?
No, partly I appreciate you doing an interview focused on foreign policy. It's not been a big part of the campaign. It was a small part of the debates, but it's absolutely critical to the future health and safety and prosperity of the United States. I mean, I don't think we're ever going to lead the world in quite the way we did for many decades after the Second World War. I think that's going to be a challenge for this administration, because you're not just going to be able to go back to the old model, but clearly the United States is going to remain deeply engaged in the world. Our well-being is going to be tremendously dependent on a peaceful and prosperous world. So I'm delighted that you're focusing the time here in your program to focus on this. So thank you.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for taking your time to come on to the show. We really appreciate it.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Eli.
Next is Richard Kaplan, Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford in London and an official fellow at the Linacre College. He is also an author of several books and has focused his research on international organizations and conflict.
Professor, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's dive right in. I really want to talk about the foreign view on the United States right now, but let's back up a little bit to prior to the pandemic. How did the United States look before COVID-19 on the world stage?
Well, better than it looks now, that's for sure. And it is difficult, of course, to generalize about global public opinion, but there is an annual survey that's done by the Pew Research Center in Washington on public opinion of the United States. It's an annual survey, and I'll just say it's difficult to summarize the findings, but since Trump was elected president, the image of the United States has declined significantly, and with COVID, it declined even more so. The US scores very low in the eyes of foreigners with respect to management of the COVID crisis compared to, for instance, their own countries or the WHO or the EU. The United States is perhaps the lowest of all actors engaged in efforts to combat coronavirus.
And how has Trump's relationships with foreign leaders like Vladimir Putin of Russia, Kim Jong-un of North Korea, Xi Jinping from China, how has that affected the United States' image?
Well, again, it's difficult to say globally. These are not considered to be democratic leaders, certainly. Many of the close relationships that he's formed during his presidency have been with authoritarian leaders, and to individuals who are concerned about the flourishing of democracy worldwide, that certainly doesn't look good.
And now to a couple of your research topics and places of your expertise. I'd like to talk about international conflict. What do you think the message or the precedent that President Trump has set for the United States in terms of how the country looks at international conflict?
Well, it's interesting that unlike some of the previous administrations, Trump has been a lot more cautious about military engagement on the part of the United States. He has intervened selectively in Syria throughout the Syrian civil war, but he promised and to a degree has delivered on a commitment to draw down and even withdraw troops from Afghanistan, from Syria, to disengage to a degree. So in some respects, again, those both at home and abroad who have been concerned about US interventionism, military intervention, have actually welcomed this aspect of Trump's foreign policy, I would say.
And a similar question, what are your thoughts on the humanitarian intervention of this administration?
With respect to?
Different humanitarian efforts across the globe, I think.
Well, again, I think that there have been too many opportunities lost. So just to give you one example, there's a terrible humanitarian crisis in Yemen in the context of the civil war there. And the Trump administration has a very close relationship with Saudi Arabia, has been selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, weapons that Saudi Arabia has been using in that civil war to support its allies in that civil war, that has certainly exacerbated the humanitarian crisis. I'd say that in that instance, certainly the Trump administration has been indifferent to the humanitarian consequences of its actions.
For those of you just tuning in, this is Around the World in 30 Minutes on 88.7 FM WRHU. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, and today we're joined by Professor Richard Kaplan from Oxford. My next question for you has a little bit more to do with that topic, but it's focused more on immigration. President Trump has imposed very strict immigration policies in the United States, and how has that come across in the international community?
Well, to a degree, immigration is, of course, thought to be a domestic concern, and every country will have its own policies with regard to immigration. We're seeing worldwide some of the greatest migration challenges that the world has faced in a very long time, and leaders across the world are certainly sympathetic to the pressures on governments to admit individuals who are fleeing some really horrible situations, repressive governments and civil wars. The United States has actually been spared a lot of that in some respects. They're not so much, if you will, on the front line of the migration flows. Instead, there have been concerns, especially, as you will know better than I, about migration from the Southern Cone, from Mexico and further south. And I don't know that there are strong views that individuals have worldwide, but there have been moments in the Trump administration that have captured the attention of the public worldwide, and especially the scenes of children, some of them infants, being separated from their families when they were apprehended on the border, and an awareness that in some cases those families have not been united. And that's something that has certainly struck a chord with a lot of people.
And the Trump administration has pulled out the United States out of various international organizations, the Paris Climate Accord, saying he wants out of the World Health Organization. How has this affected the United States' international relations?
Well, I think this is what has contributed in part to the declining image, the unfavorable image of the United States worldwide. the United States historically has supported multilateral efforts, not always wholeheartedly. It has had its reservations and criticisms of the United Nations from time to time, for instance, but it has put a lot of emphasis on multilateral responses to global problems. And Trump, of course, has been much more unilateral. And this has not been welcomed. And especially among European allies, it has raised a lot of concerns about whether the US will support their concerted efforts, their multilateral efforts, and the institutions that they have built to achieve their goals jointly, and whether they will have to, as a consequence, rely increasingly on themselves. It's been a real wake-up call, especially for the Europeans, the Trump administration.
And now to a big question, especially here in the United States, how have other countries, and this can be your personal experience viewing this, or your colleagues' views, how have other countries looked at the United States during this, frankly, chaotic 2020 election?
Well, I think with horror, frankly. I mean, leaving aside the outcome, what might have been the desired outcome, the process has raised a lot of questions about the fitness of the electoral systems, because there isn't a single one across the United States. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there are any questions, unlike the questions that the Trump administration is raising about the integrity of the process. But I think that it has struck many people as odd that these are federal elections, national elections, and that there isn't a common system across all states, that the count has sometimes been very slow. Now, of course, people also recognize that these are unusual times, that there has been very high voter participation, which is actually a very good thing, and that in some respects the system has been overwhelmed with mail-in ballots and so forth. But I think that both the hiccups, if you will, some of them just technical problems that have arisen, but then, of course, the way that Trump and his more ardent supporters have raised questions about the integrity of the process, I think that many people have found this extremely disturbing, and the reluctance, indeed the resistance of the Trump supporters to accept the outcome and to accept the findings of so many independent observers that these have been free and fair elections. I think that many people have been really shocked by that.
One last time, if you're just tuning in, I'm Eli Finkelson here on Around the World in 30 Minutes on WRHU-FM, joined today by Professor Richard Kaplan from University of Oxford. One of my final questions for you is just, what are some of the important factors in a leader that a leader of a country could have, such as the United States, and how do those factors translate to foreign and international relations?
Well, I think an ability to get along with people is certainly very, very important. And again, this is something that has been in short supply in the case of Trump. I mean, there are many people who admire his brashness, his brusque style. They see him as the sort of no-nonsense leader who knows what he wants and won't let anything stand in the way. But we know that it's often necessary to make compromises. This is what politics is all about, of course, and to build relationships of mutual respect. And I think that this has not been foremost in Trump's mind, just to judge from his behavior and the nature of his relationships with world leaders. And I think that this is one thing that Joe Biden has a lot of experience with, and which many leaders around the world are going to welcome in terms of a a change in the tone and style of the next administration.
Do you have any final thoughts on any of the topics? I know we covered a lot today, but do you have any final thoughts on any of the topics that we covered today?
Well, I think everybody's just holding their breath, really, waiting for transition to actually begin. It seems to have been stalled. And although in both the United States and worldwide there are admirers of Trump, I think it is fair to say that many people are breathing a sigh of relief. Many people are looking forward to, in some respects, a return to normality, return to more familiar style and substance of governance. Yes, I mean, I think that's where we are at the moment. I think that, as I said, it will be for many people a very welcome change.
Professor Richard Kaplan, International Relations Professor at University of Oxford. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you to both Edward Alden and Professor Richard Kaplan for that expertise. That will do it for this week's edition of Around the World in 30 Minutes. Special thank you to producer Cassidy Slamman, reporter Connor Donnelly, and researchers Daniel Gall and Matt McDermott. I'm Eli Finkelson. Keep an eye out, America. There's more around the world than you might think.